Chris Bennett is my guest today, author of many books, including the latest one titled Liber 420, Cannabis, Magical Herbs, and the Occult. I wish we had more time to talk, but the conversation went only for an hour. So we touched upon a few interesting topics, such as alchemy, Holy Grail, Soma, Sufism, which I think will be interesting for anyone who looked into it in order to find answers. I hope you enjoy our conversation and give us a like. All right, Chris Bennett is my guest today. Glad to have you here. Thank you for coming, Chris.
Well, thanks for having me. My pleasure.
All right, I'm very excited to, actually, I was very excited to meet you because you write about things that I was curious about since very early age. We go back to my late teens when I was smoking cannabis and reading books on occultism, and trying to figure out where do I dig to find the Holy Grail, So it's dear to my heart what you write about this. It's like
nice.
kind of my life path too. So it's amazing that we can talk about things, and I will just ask you things that I'm just interested myself, and then we just have a conversation, build up on top of that. Okay.
Sounds good.
I just want to introduce you a bit more. So Chris Bennett wrote 4 books so far, and his latest book, which called Liber 420, that's the book we will be talking about mostly here. And then, of course, the conversation can go to different places, but that will be kind of a base. And that's the book that I highly recommend to anyone who is curious about medieval magic, alchemy, and occultism and everything that was connected to it, and if you're interested to go into the roots of it and see how things connected before the two, and it goes to Gnosticism and other interesting topics. So it's a massive book. It's like 800 pages. It's a massive research. So I can appreciate it from the perspective of, an author. As myself an author, I can appreciate how much effort went to this book. So let's just start from just maybe introduce yourself and how you got to writing and what's your life path.
Yeah, well, a little over 30 years ago, I had a very powerful religious experience under cannabis, and I couldn't decide if I had just had a delusionary experience or if there was something to it. I started combing the record for accounts of people having spiritual experiences under cannabis, and Green Gold, the Tree Life, Marijuana, Magic, and Religion. And then I just kept expanding on that area of research. And all my books have really been about basically the same thing, the role of cannabis in magic and religion. And it's a fascinating history. And, the really nice thing about studying cannabis in this respect, as opposed to some of the other entheogenic substances, is there's just so much historical data on cannabis. It appears the name is very ancient. Cannabis is a Latin term and has been, and we also know its name in various other languages is well established. And then there's a lot of archaeological evidence, right? As opposed to things like, mushrooms, where people will say, oh, well, this tree looks like a mushroom, and this must indicate secret mushroom used by Christians or Buddhists or somebody, wherever the image comes from. And it's pretty speculative, right? I like the ability to not speculate so much when it comes to cannabis. Of course, I speculate here and there, but I try to address speculation as speculation and fact is fact. And the wealth of facts in regards to cannabis, make it clear that it played a paramount role in religions like Taoism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and many other religions. And it's also a fact that it was used by alchemists and medieval magicians. And that's just the historical facts. So I like that about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, solid. It's a solid research, something you can refer. So maybe we can start from a history of alchemy and just
Yep.
go around that and the Holy Grail, the legend of the Holy Grail, and everything around it, where it started, what from your research, what were the roots? Where did it
Well,
start?
I think, when we start talking about alchemy, I think, alchemy you could interpret alchemy to go way, way, way back. But I think the real place where alchemy started would be with a figure like Zosimos in the 4th century AD. And Zosimos was trying to take the group initiations that were in Gnosticism and other mystery schools and make them a singular form of initiation, a self-initiation. And this is kind of where alchemy kind of comes in. And he was very into plant extracts, like tinctures and things like that. He talked a lot about that. A technique he claimed to have picked up from Mary the Jewess, that one of the first alchemists was a female, Mary the Jewess. And writing in the 4th century AD, he referred specifically to how the Egyptians were using cannabis mixed into wine or beer, along with things like darnel, another psychoactive plant, for magical purposes. So this establishes its role fairly early in these sorts of traditions, right? And then when we go to about the 12th, 13th century, tinctures known as arcanums, which means kind of secret elixir, or quintessences, which means fifth essence. And the fifth essence, there's like the body, the salt, all the different elements, right? The fifth essence was like the soul, and they believe that when you took a plant and you put it into alcohol, it extracted the soul of the plant, the quintessence, the fifth essence. And if you kept doing it into this tincture, you could increase the potency of that plant by 20, 30 times, right? And this is kind of one of the earliest forms of medicine, these potent tinctures known as quintessences, Paracelsus, that he prescribed for epilepsy. We know today that epilepsy is very treatable by cannabis. And his own philosopher's stone was probably as solidified of his quintessence of opium that he referred to as laudanum, and just let the alcohol extract out, and that would form into solid balls. He was said to carry around mouse-sized turds in the pommel of his sword, in order to, and that would be his philosopher's stone, right? So this is pretty early on in alchemy. And in regards to arcanums and quintessences, we find references to cannabis in these preparations. They used other plants too. You can make a quintessence of mandrake, you can make a quintessence of cannabis, all sorts of varieties of plants, right? We find references to these quintessences with references to cannabis in the Lullian Corpus, which is one of the most famous groups of texts regarding alchemy, in the works of Cardano, Avicenna, the Islamic alchemist. He refers to cannabis tinctures or cannabis infused wines, and Rabelais, a 16th century alchemist who wrote the famous book Gargantua and Pantagruel, incorporated cannabis in there, as well as others, So it was very well known in alchemy. Now, you also mentioned the Holy Grail, and this is largely based on the 12th century, 13th century poems and stuff that we know about, is where the story started emerging. And often the Knights Templar are mentioned in reference to the Holy Grail as being the carriers of the Grail. And it's interesting because the Templars are very controversial group of warrior monks in the 12th to 13th, 14th century, who were eventually shut down and by the church and persecuted for heresy. We know that the Templars did in fact have Sabians, Arab people, growing cannabis for them in Spain. And Spain's not a climate where you would grow industrial hemp. And Arabs are not specialized in growing industrial hemp. They know about resin cannabis. This is an area where resin cannabis would have been growing. As well, in the raids of the Templar compounds, both in France and in England, there's large records of everything that was seized from the compound, and large amounts of cannabis were seized from both compounds. It's just listed as raw cannabis. So it's probably cannabis flowers or something like that, because things like rope and cloth were designated as such. And this is just designated as cannabis. So it's likely that the Templars may have picked up some sort of mystic use or alchemical use of cannabis. They were familiar by this time with the workings of Avicenna. They had contact with groups like the Hashishin, a group of Islamic heretics that were reputed to use cannabis in their own initiations and possibly influenced by earlier Gnostic influences. So I would say that's kind of how it comes into the whole Grail mythology. The term Grail itself is related to an Indo-European term, grahas. And the grahas was the cup that held Soma. And when you really go back into the origins of the Grail myth, you start to find connections a lot in Persian mythology. A lot of it's Parsifal is even thought to have elements of Persia in the name, you know, and other terms in the Grail mythology. And this brings us into the cannabis-infused wines used by Zoroastrians, written about in Zoroastrians' texts, and the cup of Jepitath, which was like a cup which you looked into and saw visions. And likely what you drank from it helped to see the visions, and then you stared into the bleakness of the cup and you would see a vision in there. This is all related to the development of the Grail mythos, right? So there's some pretty strong connections there that I go over in my work regarding that.
What do you think was in the Sufis wine? Was it metaphorical? Was it something infused in it, or just literally wine, or it was just like spiritual wine, as as people think?
Well, absolutely, we know that Sufis, in some cases, did mix cannabis into wine. There's actual historical records to Sufis hashish and mixing their hashish in wine. A lot of Sufis, like there's a lot of poetry, there's a book called Herbs. I got it here somewhere, but I don't know. The Herb versus Medieval Muslim Society, and it's about hashish and medieval Muslim society, and it's a collection of poems from both sides. A lot of poems. Some Sufis are praising wine and condemning hashish, and other groups of Sufis are praising hashish and condemning wine, and then there's some that are mixing both together. Right? The mixing of cannabis into wine is very ancient. We have archaeological evidence of cannabis-infused wines from France from 2,000 years ago, from Pompeii about 2,100 years ago, right? Hassan I-Sabbah was friends with the famous poet. I'm just trying to think of this Islamic 11th, 12th century poet's name, Omar Khayyam. And Omar Khayyam, unfortunately, and it's hard to say which ones are legit and which ones were just by authors using his name. But in some of the poems attributed to Omar Khayyam, there's definitely references to hashish and wine and indications of their mixture. And that would strengthen that connection for the hashishin, if those were indeed poems written by Omar Khayyam. Yeah, definitely. And that's where a lot of the spiritual wine poetry comes from, is from the poems of Omar Khayyam, right? So it's very hard to say, because there are these references to hashish, and I go over some of these poems. They're not in the more famous Fitzgerald translations, but they're in some of the other translations of Omar Khayyam poems by other translators who collect poems. That's where the whole spiritual wine tradition comes in. So we do know in that same tradition there is references to hashish infused wines.
So why do you think Fitzgerald omitted hemp from poetry of Khayyam?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think Fitzgerald has omitted the
Oh, I don't
reference?
even know that he would have been aware. There's like thousands of these poems, right? It might not have been anything intentional. You know, he probably collected, oh, I like this poem, I like that poem, you know what I mean? It's not like 19th century writers were trying to hide cannabis in Islam. There's like so much written about cannabis in this time period. It's kind of like a renaissance for Europe with cannabis when they come in the 19th century after Napoleon's escapades. Cannabis starts coming really back into Europe. There's kind of like a period there where it's pretty unknown almost. But in that same period, there's just a wealth of material coming out of the East, and there's lots of writing about people experimenting in the Mideast and accounts of their experience.
That's very interesting because, you know, Omar Khayyam was the first Sufi to whom I was introduced in my teens. You know, I was about 17 years old when I was reading Khayyam, and it really touched my heart. This is where things probably started for me. You know, it was Cannabis and Omar Khayyam. Later, I already read Rumi and
Oh, there
Hafiz
you
and
go.
others, but Omar Khayyam was, you know, the depth. It was just all there. It was profound understanding of mystery that nobody can name, you know, not even them too, but they pointed out to it, you know, and they basically guiding you through it, telling you how to live your life. And I really,
Absolutely.
I was like, I was guided by this for years on my search, you know. Still now I like to read Khayyam in ceremonies, you know. But you know, it was very important question for
You know,
me. It, it was a very important question for me all these years, asking myself, was it something in this wine? Because my feeling was that
yeah,
it wasn't just a wine. They were doing something there. There was some kind of plant either mixed in it, like literally, or it was a code name for something, you know. It's just
yeah.
because obviously, you know, and I write in one of my books, I write about this, like, you know, I've drunk wine, you know, and I know many people who drank wine, and not much wisdom's come out of it, you know. You just get drunk and you know, go to sleep, you know. So there was something there that you can feel, you can sense that these people were onto something. They were ingesting some kind of psychoactive plant that was hidden in the words, you know. So if I would see the reference, which was, you know, saying like, okay, these people were you know, infusing cannabis, that would make it easier to go through this, you know. And in the same way, you know, we go back to India now and to Soma. And Soma is the same thing. It was the actual drink. It's not just a myth. It's not just a song. It's not just a hymn, you know. And those cups were full of medicine to get to these higher realizations. That was clear to me when I was in my teens, but I didn't know what was there, you know. So what is, let's move to India now and let's talk about Soma. What do you think from your research? What was Soma and what's the roots of it?
You know, this has been a major debate for centuries amongst religious scholars, and prominently the ideas put forth by the banker and mycologist R. Gordon Wasson that Soma was a fly agaric mushroom have predominated the field in the last few decades. My view is very different from Wasson's, and I go over Wasson's theory in my book on Soma and take it apart and show, like, Soma was a plant, a sacred drink, a god, and the moon in the sky. And as it was, this moon in the sky was seen as a celestial cup of Soma that the gods drank from. And as it waned, the gods were drinking Soma. And as it refilled, the gods were refilling the cup. And a lot of the Soma rituals were connected to the moon because of this relied largely on references to Soma as the moon, and thus was using these moon descriptions to tie it in with a round Amanita muscaria cap, right? And he actually left out the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. The 10th mandala of the Rig Veda has the most descriptive accounts of Soma, the plant, in it. And it refers to it as a green and purple tree. It describes it being processed by smashing it with stones, and much like how you grind cannabis in India to make the drink bong, and smashing it with stones, and the faces of the stones turning green from smashing it. So they're clearly talking about a plant. Branches are mentioned as well. Likewise, as with Khayyam, the counterpart of Sayoma in the Avestan literature. In the Vedic and the Avestan literature, Avestas from Persia, and this was the Mazdan religion that led to Zoroastrianism. In India, we have the Vedic religion, the Rig Veda, where the Soma is mentioned, and this led to Hinduism in India. But both these religions were thought to start from some earlier Indo-European source. And because they're both written in Indo-European languages. And Indo-European languages is also the mother tongue for most of our European languages as well, right? And so there's a lot of commonalities in root words for all these languages, right? Cannabis is in there with all this as well, right? And we know that Indo-European culture has been using cannabis ritually for as far back as 5,500 years ago. From Ukraine and Romania, they found censers, ceramic bowls that were, cannabis was burnt in for funerary rituals. And this was practiced by Indo-European culture for thousands of years. Later on, around 500 BC, we find the Scythians using the same cannabis and the fumes inhaled inside a tent. Similarly, we find this with an Indo-European group that was in central China from about 2000 to 400 BC. The Gushi or Jushi, Tocharian-speaking people, they were similarly growing cannabis and burning it in rituals. And so there's a long history of Indo-European use. And this goes back to a time period before the Avesta and the Vedic writers split off from their Indo-European ancestors and went in their different directions and started creating their own religious beliefs around them. So my view is that is based on a lot of like recent archaeology. And in China, as I mentioned, they found these Indo-European groups that were using cannabis and cultivating cannabis. There's a recent paper saying that psychoactive cannabis actually originated in the same region around 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, breaking off from the more fibrous quality cannabis and being specifically grown for its psychoactive properties, right? And these people here, we know that they were in contact with groups like the Scythians. And the Scythians in this region, one of the names for them was the Khayyam Varga. That means Khayyam gatherers. And Khayyam, as I mentioned, is the Persian counterpart of Soma. And the Scythians that gathered Khayyam, it was said of them that they burnt and drank Khayyam. And we have recovered from Scythian sites golden vessels that were used for drinking a preparation of cannabis and opium. And we know that these Chinese Indo-Europeans were in contact through the Scythian trade routes with another region called the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex. And this is in Afghanistan. And in this region in the 90s, a Russian archaeologist, Victor Sarianati, sorry, it's been, we have huge fires out here, so there's a lot of smoke in the air. He claimed to have found 3 temple sites in the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex that he said were dedicated to the preparation of Khayyam, dedicated to the sacred beverage, his preparation. And he found evidence, he said, of ephedra, cannabis, and in some cases, poppy. Now, they also found ephedra with these same Chinese guys that had the cannabis that I mentioned there, the Indo-Europeans. And there's a kind of a yin-yang relationship with cannabis in China, because one's very relaxing, one's very stimulating, you know. And they kind of share a name. One is Mahua, and the other one is Huama. And the reversals of the name because of their similarity. And in China, at this time period, and Taoists were also picking up the spiritual use of cannabis around the same time. And we're talking about 500, 600 BC. And it's appearing in Taoist writings as a plant of immortality, an elixir of immortality. And that's what Soma is, an elixir of immortality. It is believed, that the Chinese term was somehow picked up by the Scythians, Huma, and when it came into the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, it came in as Huma, and so this eventually became Hayoma, and then through further linguistic changes, became Soma in the Vedic region. We know that cannabis was largely imported into India at first during the early period of early Vedic period, because there's lots of references to this and how it was taxed and stuff like that. And we also know from the archaeological record and samples of soil that cannabis was not indigenous to this region of India, right? So the idea is that Huma became placed on this cannabis beverage as the ephedra, and the cannabis came down from the Tocharian Gushi into China, into the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, and then this, as it further went into India, it became Soma. And there's a lot more evidence for this than what I can explain here. Obviously, it takes huge amounts of space to go over it. But if you take a look at even the disappearance of Soma, it's completely wound up to access to this Chinese cannabis being cut off, and took a while for the indigenous Indian industry to pick up on cannabis growing and producing and stuff like that. And so it kind of fell into the background for a while.
So what is the origin from your research? The pre-Indian origin?
Well, the Indian origin originates with these
pre-Indian.
I'm sorry?
The pre-Indian, like, who were using?
Yeah, these would be with Indo-Europeans in China who were using cannabis ritually, Scythians who were drinking it as well, and the adoption of the name Huma to cannabis becoming Hayoma. So it's merely, cannabis has been in use by Indo-Europeans for a long time. What happens is this new term comes into play, and that kind of spreads into, and as it spreads into those regions, it's adopted this Chinese name, Huma, which means fire cannabis or Scythian cannabis, and refers specifically to these more psychoactive strains of cannabis. And so it's the adoption of this name into the Vedic religion, but the use of cannabis for spiritual purposes is much, much older than either the Vedic or Avestan religion, and goes back to like 5,500 years ago for funerary purposes.
So the Sichin, these guys were Europeans.
Yeah, they were like they're kind of like a mixed race, you know, like Eurasian, I guess would be the better term. Like it's such a broad term for so many groups. In the Persian region, they're called Saka. In the northern region, they're called Scythian. But they're all kind of share some cultural connections of language and mythology and that type of thing. But they're really like this term Scythian is like this blanket term for just groups of Indo-European tribes that would be very hard to talk about because there's just so many different names involved and groups and time periods that we just use this blanket term Scythian. It's kind of like the term Gnosticism to describe all the competing groups of Christianity in the first few centuries AD. They're all labeled Gnostic now. None of them would have known themselves by the name Gnostic. They would be the Nicolaitans, the Ophites, whatever, but we refer to them as Gnostic in this collective name. Same thing with the Scythians. There's just loads of different tribes that are designated Scythian now.
Well, we'll get to Gnostic in a second. I just wanted to ask you about the Bon tradition, the pre-Buddhist Tibet.
Yeah,
This was shamanic tradition from my research, and
absolutely. Yeah,
Buddhists came and just eradicated them, and built their temples, and that's it. They just conquered basically them.
yeah.
You know, from your research, what do you think they were using?
I haven't really looked at like the Bon religion myself, enough to really comment on the pre-Buddhist situation. In Buddhism, like from about 3rd, 4th century, I think AD, there's a text that refers to Buddha subsisting on 1 hemp seed a day under the Bodhi tree before announcing his divine revelations, right? But I would say Buddhism and its origins, this has a lot to do with the disappearance of Soma. Buddhism was a huge influence on India, even outside of like religious beliefs, in the sense that vegetarianism, the bans on alcohol, all that stuff came in through Buddhism. Those things were allowed in the Vedic religion, and Buddhism was a real reaction to the Vedic religion. Vedism was controlling all aspects of people's lives. If you wanted to get married, you'd have to hire a Vedic priest and pay a bunch of money. If you wanted to hold a Soma ritual, you'd have to pay taxes to the Soma guy, bringing in the Soma, to the priest officiating the ritual, all this types of stuff. And everything you did, had a child, built a house, all these things required certain rituals, and it was all very complicated. And Buddhism did away with all that type of stuff, right? Came down to much more simpler religion. And it also did away with a lot of ecstatic practices. It's much more of a sober kind of contemplative type of thing, right? And that's, according to some of the authors on the subject, is where we start to see the prohibition and disappearance of Soma, is with the arrival of Buddhism. And it's not until the resurgence of Hinduism, centuries later, that we start to see this kind of cannabis use come back ritually with followers of Shiva and stuff like that. They were probably always there in the background, but India was predominantly Buddhist for centuries. There's a large period of time there where it's predominantly Buddhist, right? In Buddhism later, in Tibetan Buddhism, 10th century, 9th century, 11th century, we start to see cannabis appearing in Buddhist texts like the Tara Tantra, the Mahakala Tantra, and other texts, and it's clearly being used for yogic purposes there, for the sort of shamanic practices we might have expected in Taoism, where it's kind of like an astral traveling type of situation, but also as it was used by Sufis and stuff, to blow away the ego, to get to a place of unity where there's no duality, right? And that's a big draw, I think, both in Hinduism with sadhus that use cannabis, and in Islam with Sufis that use cannabis. A goal was to obliterate the ego death, and get down to that core of energy that is pulsating life out from us beyond the realm of thought, And that's kind of what the goal of yoga is all around, right? That's why there's such a intimate connection between cannabis and yoga, is because yoga is to like make your body still enough so it's not distracting you with aches and pains and uncomfort, so that you can sit there and totally lose yourself, your ego, undo your personality, and get down to that common core, that essence, that is the essence of God that's inside of us all, behind us.
So when do you think the Soma disappeared from like being practiced in India?
Well, it had to do, as I said, with the rise of Buddhism and this suppression of these ecstatic practices for a more contemplative and sober type of worldview, right? But also access to the quality cannabis that was coming out of China, Chinese Turkmenistan, and following these trade routes through the ancient world. And it wasn't only making its way into India. We have recently, last year, they announced 8th century BC evidence of cannabis resins being burnt in a temple in Jerusalem. And this was, is very fascinating. This is all part of the same trade network, right? And this time it's traveling with the Indo-European name for cannabis, canna. And that's the root word for all of our cannabis terms, chambra, hanf, all these different European terms is this root word canna. And the Scythians also went into the Mideast. In fact, there was a city in Israel, Scythopolis, an ancient Israel, because of they were so well known in the region. And cannabis came into Israel and fueled the religion of the Bible. I mentioned that in 8th century BCE, there's evidence of a temple in Arad, Jerusalem, where cannabis was burnt on an altar. And this was used to talk to Yahweh. And this is very interesting because I'd been suggesting that cannabis had been used by the ancient Hebrew for like 25, 30 years before this discovery, based on the research of the etymologist and anthropologist Sula Bennett, who writing in the 1930s suggested there was a Hebrew term, cannabis, that appears in Exodus, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Song of Songs, and Jeremiah, that was actually a reference to cannabis. And this is a fascinating proposition because in the first of these references, Exodus 30:23, God, who first appears to Moses in flames of fire from within a burning bush, commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil with about 6 pounds of cannabis mixed with myrrh and cinnamon and cassia into about a gallon and a half of olive oil. Every time Moses is to speak to the Lord, he's to place some of this oil on his skin, and THC is fatty soluble and can actually pass through the skin. Oil's a very good means of transferring this. And he also takes some of this oil and he places it on the altar of incense, what is referred to as the tent of the meeting. This is a very small enclosed area inside the bigger temple. And then he talks to the Lord, in fact, in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense. And so when you throw cannabis into this scenario, becomes very controversial. Sula Bennett said that when the Hebrew texts were translated into the Greek about 300 BC, a mistranslation took place. And this Hebrew term, cannabisum, was mistranslated as calamus. And this mistranslation followed through to the modern Bibles. But the original term here was cannabis. And this evidence out of Arad, Jerusalem, seems to confirm this theory. And so this is pretty radical stuff because I think Terence McKenna, the great entheogen pioneer, I think one of his greatest contributions to this field of research was bringing in Julian Jaynes' theory of the origins of consciousness that he put forth in his book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And Jaynes' theory was that ancient man didn't think in the same way that we do. Thinking was an evolutionary development that took place. But the first people that experienced the ability to think experienced it much like a schizophrenic does. It's a voice coming from outside of themselves. They'd hear the voice of their chief or the voice of their father. And this would kick in at times of upheaval and stress. Prior to that, people were just so consumed with survival that they didn't really have time for a lot of reflective thinking. We're more like animals. You know, speaking operates actually in a very different area of the brain than thinking. And many animals have kind of language-like capabilities, signals and sounds that mean things to each other, right? You know, and consciousness kind of develops out of this. And so in Jaynes' theory, this could kick in at times of stress of upheaval or maybe sickness when you have a fever. McKenna added to this with the idea that you could create a fire in the brain by ingesting psychoactive substances. And when we take a look at Moses' situation, he goes inside the tent of the meeting and he burns cannabis. And this is very similar to how the Scythians did it as well, right? A tent, a brazier, cannabis thrown in the brazier and inhale the fumes, right? This is just a little slightly more advanced version of that same sort of thing. And so he goes into the tent and he burns the cannabis and he stares into the smoke and he says, Lord, what should we do? And then finally a voice reaches back out of the smoke and says, Moses, this is what you must do. Tell the people of Israel this. And he gives them the answer. And Moses is outside of the tent and says, this is what the Lord says we must do. And none of the other Israelites in the story ever see God. They only see Moses inside the tent and smoke pouring out of the tent, right? And so this is like classic shamanism, and it's a real threat to fundamental religion. I would say it's on par, when fully understood, with Darwin's theory of evolution in comparison to the story of Adam and Eve and the myths of Genesis, because what is revealed here is the plant-based shamanic origins of religion itself, which is very ironic when you consider how these Abrahamic religions dealt with shamanic practices when they came into contact with them. You know, particularly later Christianity, when it came into the New World and it witnessed things like peyote ingestion, mushroom ingestion. This was all deemed witchcraft and demonic behavior. These were the devil's sacraments, not to be had. But then when we take a look back to the origins of their religion, we find the same sort of practice. And this is radical information. This is a paradigm shift that is happening, I think, through archaeology and the study of the historical record. And it's what humanity needs right now. This is the medicine we need, man.
I completely agree with you. I speak about this out loud. I write this in my books. I came to this same realization through my medicines, and it's like a main theme of my of my writing, that all religions basically have roots in intelligence. It's all intelligenic religions that happens before, and then it just got controlled because it's all.
Well, it doesn't require an intercessor, like the big thing about religion, like Christianity, is like we hold the keys to heaven.
Yeah.
You have to come to us and we tell you why it is that this is true. It's not about self-experience. This was a big difference between Gnosticism. Gnosticism was about knowledge, and you had to have your own experience of self-knowledge as a Gnostic. It wasn't something you were taught, man. It was something you experienced. Whereas modern Christianity, which is really the Church of Paul, not the Church of Jesus, it should be called Paulianity, because it's his stamp. It's his version of Christianity. He was persecuting Christians. He talks about it. That's what the whole story is. He's like persecuting Christians, having them sent off to death. And then he allegedly had a vision on the road to Damascus that blinded him. He likely had taken sacraments he'd seized from Gnostics and had a vision, and his own distorted worldview was projected out that, because, all knowledge and these experiences isn't always light and pretty. Psychedelics and entheogenic substances can go to some very dark places in the wrong hands. Take a look at the Manson family, for instance, right? And not all shaman in the jungle are good people either, right? You know what I mean? These are tools. You can use a hammer to build a house, or you can use it to smash somebody's head in. Same sort of thing with entheogenic substances, man. And they should always, anybody that gets into these, the biggest rule is self-governance, man. This is you and your body, and you're in charge, nobody else. And you need to make your own decisions, and you need to base your own decisions on your own knowledge. And that means like doing some research before you start following this path, and taking it pretty seriously, because you can't always trust people, man. That's one of the things you'll learn in life.
So what do you think was the burning bush?
I think that's likely an allegorical symbol, for the cannabis that was being used myself. There's some competing theories, like Professor Benny Shannon. He suggests that acacia was used because acacia can have DMT in it, the acacia bark, and this was somehow mixed with Syrian root. And acacia is mentioned in the Bible, but it's a hardwood, and it was a very well-known hardwood. My view is that it was a hardwood. I don't think the evidence is there to show a preparation was made based solely on references to hardwood. Other people have pointed to mushroom use, and it's like I don't want to give the impression that I don't respect these substances that I'm talking about. They're absolutely, you can have very, very powerful experiences, spiritual experiences on DMT-containing substances. There's no doubt about that. Likewise with mushrooms, you can have very, very powerful spiritual experience with mushrooms. South America, North American history is proof of that. But I think, like to suggest like something like the manna in the Bible was psychoactive mushrooms based on the passage given is I'm just not convinced. It's probably something more like lichen or something like that. There's not strong enough evidence, and that was what I was saying. What I liked about cannabis research is there's like so much historical data on it. You know what I mean? And now we have the archaeological evidence from the Holy Land regarding its use there, right? I don't doubt that other substances were used. Mandrake was certainly known to the ancient Hebrews, and I can't see how they would miss opium with its prevalence of use throughout the ancient Near East. But I think there's a tendency with some modern researchers, and I've written about this. I've written critical reviews. I just wrote one of Professor Jerry Brown's The Psychedelic Gospels. I've written a critical review of Mike Crowley's The Secret Drugs of Buddhism. I've written a critical review of R. Gordon Wasson's theory on Soma and the Fly Agaric. And I've written a critical review of Flattery and Schwartz's theory about Syrian rue, Haoma, and Harmaline as well. And I discussed the points where I think that these things fall apart. I haven't really got a lot of response from these other authors on it. They're not too happy with me, but I feel that they should be at least addressing the criticisms that are being put forth if they want to hold on to their theories. And in regards to cannabis and soma, that is gaining in prominence over the fly agaric theory. You're starting to see this on books on Persian history. They're siding with cannabis and ephedra mix for Haoma and other texts as well. Many well-known Indologists like Elaine Danilo, D.L. Basham are pointing to cannabis as a source of soma. So it is kind of happening among scholarly circles, but not so much. I find that in the entheogenic and psychedelic community, some things are just kind of become entrenched, and it's hard for these researchers to shake this off. And a lot of people are building on these shaky foundations, in my opinion. And so I think that some real critical thinking is not being applied in the areas of entheological and psychedelic research. I respect some researchers like Tom Hatsis is a very good, solid researcher, and there's other ones. Mike Jay is a very good, solid researcher. But there's a lot of loose research out there, in my opinion.
So maybe we can talk about Gnosticism a little bit and how, the confrontation they had with the latest, with the charge, basically. And
well, I
maybe,
mentioned like Moses's holy anointing oil, right? And this was something that played. It was also used as an incense and drank in the Old Testament period, mixed with wine. There's references to cannabis infused wines and stuff. One of the biggest, now the name itself, Christ, is actually the Greek translation of a Hebrew term, Messiah, and it makes direct reference to this anointing oil that was described in Exodus 30:23 that contained cannabis. And in the Bible, Jesus baptizes no one, but in the oldest of the synoptic gospels, Mark, he sends out the 12 apostles with anointing oil to heal the sick and cast out demons. Casting out demons in these days may well have meant treating somebody for epilepsy, because it was thought to be demonic possession up until the medieval time. And we have references in Assyrian text to Kanabu, which is the Assyrian name for cannabis, ointments being used for hand of ghosts, which is thought to have been a reference to epilepsy. And we see later, again, I mentioned Paracelsus earlier in the 16th century, applying a cannabis topical preparation for epilepsy, similar to this suggestion here we're talking for Jesus. And even in the New Testament texts, they say those who have received the anointing oil require no teacher because they have been anointed. And one of the main points of contention noted by Gnostic scholars, such as Kurt Rudolph, between Gnostic sects and what became the Catholic Church was over water baptism versus anointing with oil. And in the Gnostic texts recovered from the Nag Hammadi library texts discovered in 1945, which is a cache of Gnostic texts thought to be from the 3rd or 4th century AD, hidden from the hands of the Catholic Church, who was out to destroy them. it refers specifically how there was only water in the baptism, but there's fire in the anointing oil. And through the anointing oil, we're initiated to unfading bliss. And through the anointing oil, we become Christ because we have received the chrism. And they refer to it for medical purposes as well, such as straightening the crooked limbs. And in another Gnostic text, it refers to Jesus giving the apostles a box full of medicine and unguents because he says you have to heal the body first before you can heal the soul. So there's a lot of indications there that these earlier practices had continued on to some extent. And in later texts, such as the Book of Jude from the Bruce Codex, a 4th century Gnostic text, it gets very entheogenic. They are burning an incense that contains a wonder. And then Jesus is taking vines and putting them into wine bottles with wine and, like leaving them to soak. And putting a plant that has a name, I forget what name it's used, but these, I've forgotten the name of it, but it's a plant that was known in Greek texts as well because it was used for prophesizing and stuff like that. And Jesus takes that same plant and puts it in the mouth of the apostles. Now that could be a reference to something like mushrooms. We just don't know what it is. It's a plant. It was associated by the Greeks with the mysteries of Osiris and put into the mouths of apostles, and as well as they're inhaling smoke and drinking infused wines and burning and eating other plants. It's all very entheogenic, as well as another reference to infused wines in the account of a Gnostic teacher, Mark. And this is written by the Catholic fathers condemning Gnosticism. Ignatius, I think, Irenaeus writes about this in the 3rd century. And he's talking about infused wines that impart the power of grace, this goddess, on those who ingest it. So clearly Gnosticism is very, very entheogenic. And Gnostic scholars are starting to embrace this idea now. First, 20 years ago, when I was writing about this was almost unheard of in Gnostic scholarship. But Gnostic scholarships are starting to recognize references like the account of Mark by Irenaeus and the Bruce Codex as clear use of psychoactive substances in the early Christian period.
I read the Nag Hammadi. Well, not the whole thing. I have the book here, and I found it a difficult text to go through. It's kind of incomplete. It's abrupted. It's like
well, not fragmented. Yeah, you kind of have to read to kind of get. For one thing, those texts, they're not from one group of Gnostics. I mentioned that it's a blanket term, Gnosticism. There's all sorts of different beliefs in Gnosticism. There's some prevailing themes, like the biblical God, Yahweh, was actually the demon, and the serpent was actually the good guy. That's a pretty prevailing theme in Gnosticism. But not all Gnostic sects believe that even, and so it's kind of confusing because there's probably texts in there that are written by different groups that had different beliefs. A lot of these texts were produced by Gnostics based on their own experiences. But I think what you kind of need to do to really kind of get a gist of the whole thing is you got to read what the church fathers said about the Gnostics, but keep in mind they're condemning them. They're their enemies, right? And so not everything can be taken as valid. Some of it's just propaganda against their enemies, and some of it's, they don't know. They're just guessing or making shit up based on what they know. And then also there's some Gnostic texts that survived that were not in the Nag Hammadi library, like the Pistis Sophia and the Bruce Codex and other texts. And so those are important to be aware of the Nag Hammadi texts, right? But the Nag Hammadi texts themselves, these were hidden in a cave, and they're fragmented, so you could have a text that's missing half the page or parts of the page where stuff's worn out. And so there's a sentence and half the sentence is missing, and then it picks up again. And so that's another challenge, is what are those missing words saying, and so some things we can only kind of guess at, what fill in the blanks as best we can. But in many ways, my view is the discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts with things like the Gospel of Thomas, thought to be a collection of actual sayings from Jesus, is in fact the resurrection of Jesus that everybody's waiting for. The Gnostic Jesus is the resurrection, because, you know, in the Bible, Jesus refers to the secrets and mysteries, and he says it's not, he can only reveal these in parables. He can't talk about these directly. And then we find this cache of documents where Jesus is talking directly about these same mysteries. And so, you know, in a very different Jesus than the Jesus depicted in the New Testament, a laughing Jesus, a Jesus with a sense of humor, you know, a loving Jesus, a Jesus that kisses Mary, and all these things, you know, and it's a radical re-envisioning of Jesus. And I'm saying that this is the resurrection of the literary Jesus.
A Jesus that eats cannabis too, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Jesus that heals with cannabis, you know.
So,
and we take a look at even the miracles in the New Testament, the healing of the blind man with the clay poultice on his eyes, the healing of the menstruating woman, the demon-possessed child. These are all types of ailments that cannabis has been used for. Cannabis is very effective for glaucoma. It's very effective for epilepsy. It's been used as for menstruating problems. You know, there was a patented medicine for such diseases prior to Prohibition. And so, you know, there may be some sort of connection that we can show here through science and history. And, you know, I should point out that Arad Jerusalem is not the only archaeological discovery of cannabis in the Holy Land. From 4th century AD, which is in this Gnostic period that we're talking about, in Bet Shemesh, Israel, they found a tomb of a young woman who died during childbirth, and cannabis had been used topically and as an incense in that tomb on that woman. So we know that it was used in exactly these ways that I'm referring to here. Absolutely it was used that way in that area, in that time period.
Do you know, like, if I want to go through Nag Hammadi and without going through the whole thing, do you remember a part where Jesus speaks directly, and what we're just talking about is like, where would they go? Any reference? Do you remember?
Well, I think the Bruce Codex is really specific. I have an article, is the most specific one regarding Jesus, you know. And there's also, I don't know, I can't remember. There's so many like texts in there, but there's also this one where he gives them the unguent box. I could tell you just a second here. Right? Just give me 1 second,
Sure,
and I'll tell you.
Is it part of Nag Hammadi?
Yeah, this is part of the Nag Hammadi. Just give me 1 second, and I'll give you some text names here. Okay, in the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles, demonstrates Jesus' own view of the importance of this rite when he gives the disciples an, quote, unguent box and, quote, a pouch full of medicine with instructions to go into the city of habitation and heal the sick. He tells them, you must heal the bodies first before you can heal the heart. So, you know, in the Acts of Peter and the 12 Apostles, he's referring specifically to a pouch full of medicine and a box of unguents. And in the Acts of Thomas, he says, you are the plant of kindness. Let your power come and heal by this unction. The Acts of Thomas also refers to Indian leaves, right? Yeah, so, you know, that's one there. And then in the Bruce Codex, let me get you this reference here early. In the Bruce Codex, it's much more familiar, you know, there, in the second book of Ayu, which is believed to have been originally written down on a papyrus sometime of the 1st and 3rd century AD, it records Jesus with his 12 male disciples, along with some women disciples, to join him so he can reveal the treasury of light. And in that text, they burn an incense, which I referred to, which contained a wonder. And this is the one where they put the plants in the mouths and all that type of stuff. So, you know, these are pretty clear references, right? And then there's also this Irenaeus account where they're drinking infused wines, right? So those are some pretty clear accounts. There's other texts in the Gnostic corpus, like Zosimos, which is thought to have been influenced by Zoroastrian things. And in Zosimos, he describes his visionary experience, and he says he drank something, and then at the end of the text, which is very fragmented, unfortunately, he said, "I did not take it again." He must have been probably too freaked out from the powerful experience. And I should point out that, we can't compare our casual cannabis smoking to a lot of these entheogenic accounts of cannabis in the ancient world. When they were doing things like infusions of cannabis into wine, for instance, these were very powerful infusions. They'd knock you right out. You could be knocked out, according to Zoroastrian accounts, for a day or two, out cold. It's important to remember that cannabis was, in fact, one of the first anesthetics. By around 50 AD in China, they were using cannabis-infused wines to perform complicated operations on people. And this is another historical fact, you know what I mean? So this stuff, not only do you have a visionary experience, an out-of-body experience, it's powerful enough to knock you out, so that you could have an operation. And such powerful entheogenic experiences, this likely gave rise, this was Mircea Eliade's belief, this gave rise to the concept of a soul. It was when people were like dosing themselves with these type of substances and then having these visions and then waking up, and they're like, "Well, we saw your body there the whole time though." And he was like, "But I went to heaven and I saw all this stuff, And they're like, "Yeah, but you were here. Well, how do you explain that? Some part of me must have left my body and gone off." And this gives the idea of a soul that can separate from the body. That was Eliade's belief.
Well, it makes sense, for anyone who works with entheogens and plant medicine. Do you think Jesus learned the art of healing in Egypt from the priests when he left? I mean, we know that he was absent for like 33 years before he returned, and he was in
yeah, we don't know where Jesus was. It's like all speculative, you know what I mean? Some people don't even believe there was a historical Jesus, and that is where the lost years are. So yeah, unfortunately, that's about all the time I can give you this morning. I've got to go take care of a bit of business, but I'm happy to talk again sometime.
Sure, that's very good. We can pick up from here next time we talk, because there is much more to discuss.
Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you very much for your time, and I enjoy our conversation. And sure, let's meet again.
Okay, sounds good, brother. Take care.
Thank you very much.